It started with three of us, myself, Ted Santarelli, John Amlaw from Somerville, I was from Boston at the time, and Gerald Cunningham from Haverhill, Mass., all coming together on a railfan trip in Lewiston, Maine on the 19th of April in 1939. And we had all passed our favorite little small-town trolley system, the Biddeford and Saco, on the way up, which ran open cars much later than most other systems in the summertime. It was quite a pet of ours, and as we were discussing things on the trip, Gerald Cunningham said, "Fellows, they've ordered the buses," meaning the Biddeford and Saco was going to give up the trolleys. At this point, the three of us more or less simultaneously said, "Well, we've got to save one of the cars." We didn't have any idea how we were going to do it. Each one of us had had an unsuccessful interest in something like that in the past, and we knew that an individual of our means couldn't do anything like this, but possibly if a few of us got together, we could do something. And we were going to settle down for just the one car for a while. But the next year, Manchester Street Railway in New Hampshire was going out, and there were rumors that a group from Connecticut were going to buy one of the cars that we liked, had found a piece of abandoned right-of-way somewhere up country there, and they were going to build a line there. Well, we found that thought that was going to be rather damaging to our very small group at that time, that we'd better join forces with them and talk them into bringing the car over here. And it wasn't very long before the whole thing was dumped in our laps to carry out this operation. They would contribute money toward the purchase of the car and so forth, but it was going to be up to the treasurer and myself to carry this thing out. We started making weekly overtures to the Street Railway Company to try to buy No.38, and seemed to be repulsed. Well, sort of come back next week and we'll make a decision then. And this went on for some time, and we were getting very near to the end of the operating time of the Street Railway. It's going to be set for April of that spring. This would be April 1940. So I mentioned this to my dad, who was in the First National Bank of Boston at the time, and he said, "Well, why not go through the bank and let's see if we can't get you a letter of introduction from the officer of the Public Service New Hampshire account." So we tried that approach, and we went right up to the Public Service building on Elm Street, and Mr. Schiller was occupied at the time. His assistant, Roger Moscrop, talked to us about it, seemed to be very enthusiastic, and said, "Why, certainly, we think it's a great idea." Well, we were very short on funds, and we proposed a price of around $75 for the car on the trucks, and perhaps several $100s more if we bought the motors. And he thought this was a good idea. So we started coming up there on weekends and painting the car up and finding any missing parts and getting the car ready to go. And we stood around the car the last night, afraid that somebody would take souvenirs from it. And at that point, Mr. Moscrop and some of the other public service people walked by and said, he said to them, "This is the entire car, is the property of the Seashore Electric Railway," we called it. And no more was said. We were making our plans to move the car. We approached the Boston, Maine, got a cost of a flat car shipment over to Kennebunk. We got a price from a company then called the Chase Transfer Company in Portland, to riggers, to load the car, offload it from the flat car and bring it here. And we contacted a trucking company, and the head of the company, Eau Claire Company in Manchester, and they were very good about it and said that, "Well, all right, if you can bring the car over to this siding, we'll come down from our place and rig the car on the flat car for you, and we'll store the trucks for you until you can afford to move them another year." So the next problem came, and the trolley line had now stopped, but the power was kept on in the car barns on both sides of Traction Street and cut off from the rest of the city and the rest of the lines. They were dismantling bit by bit the trolley wire various parts of the city. And they had a very wonderful foreman in charge of the work there, who had been in charge of much of the system when it was running, and Mr. McFarland. And we talked to him about how we were going to get the car across the river to the other side. And with his tongue in his cheek, he said, "Well, why don't you call Mr. Schiller downtown and see if he'll put the power on?" Of course, expecting that Mr. Schiller would say absolutely not. So very innocently, I went to the phone and called him up, and he said, "Why, certainly, Mr. Santarelli, be glad to do that for you. Just have Mr. McFarland pull the switch and put it on again, and he can run the car over for you to the other side of the river." And He said, I hope nobody's out stealing trolley wire today. They're going to be in for an awful surprise. Well, one other friend of mine from Somerville, Dan Toomey, was with me, and we proceeded to get in the car, and Mr. McFarland made the trip very enjoyable for us by saying that, now remember, this car is not being operated by the New Hampshire Public Service. This is the Seashore Electric Railway. At this point, we both began to shiver and shake a little bit. We didn't enjoy the last trolley ride in Manchester, New Hampshire as much as we should have, nor the last trolley ride over the Merrimack River ever by any trolley car under its own power. But nonetheless, this was the case. This was getting into the end of June or early in July. I've forgotten the date. We got across the river, and we came to the place where the railroad crossed with a 90-degree crossing called a diamond. And then Mr. McFarland said, well, now what are you going to do about it? Well, we looked at each other before we began to shrink into the ground. He said, very well, he said, we're supposed to be taking down trolley wire today, but what the heck, we said, we'll help you out. So they proceeded to throw some re-railing irons they normally use for putting a car back on the track, down on the ground, and from their public service truck. And they started to derail the car and jack the trucks gradually around the corner. And everything was fine with one truck still on the track. You had your ground and we had the trolley on the wire. But when the second truck came off, there was a crowbar that was making the connection between the wheel of the trolley and the rail and set out some pretty terrible flashes. We had a permit for moving the car supposedly at between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning. This was hardly that. This was late Friday afternoon. But because the public service truck was there, why, it looked very much on the up and up, so the police simply directed traffic and we helped them direct traffic around it. And in a matter of about an hour, the back end, the rear truck of the car plumped down on the railroad track. They put a hook with a pole called a bug on the trolley car with about 500 feet of insulated wire, and the other on the trolley pole of the car, and the other on the trolley wire. And the car very nicely proceeded down to the siding, much to the Boston and Maine's surprise. They hadn't seen a trolley car run under its own power on their own track ever before. The operation was over for the night. The next morning, Eau Claire's people came down. They jacked the car up, and we pushed the flat car under it. They blocked it down. And I had read in the car manufacturer's instruction on shipping cars that you must always lock all the doors from inside the car and then climb out through the motor traps, which I did. And the car arrived several days later in Kennebunk Station, and the Chase Transfer people brought it here. It took some months before we had the money and the means to bring the other trucks over from New Hampshire. Well, that's how we started.